Hello and welcome to part 2 on the series of phrasal verbs. In part 1, I have spoken about what are phrasal verbs, what is the difference between a verb and a phrasal verb, and where do we use phrasal verbs. In this part, which is part 2, I will be talking about the 4 different kinds of phrasal verbs. I'll also be putting in a special rule which one must remember while using one of the types of phrasal verb. And in part 3, I will be talking about some common phrasal verbs which we need to use in day-to-day lives. So let's begin. Commonly it is said that there are 2 types of phrasal verbs, transitive and intransitive. As a teacher, I feel schools really don't teach phrasal verbs very well. You must understand the concepts or the types of phrasal verbs in its totality. So I would go ahead to say that there are 4 types of phrasal verbs. What are they? Let's see. Broadly, there are 2 types, transitive phrasal verbs and intransitive phrasal verbs. So a transitive phrasal verb is like a transitive verb which requires an object. So a transitive phrasal verb also requires an object, or without adding the object to the phrasal verb, the meaning is not clear. For example, he looks after their children. So if you just say he looks after, an obvious question arises, after what? So he looks after the library, he looks after the children, he looks after the gardens. There is an object which is required. They carried on with their work. So carried on. So they carried on with what? They carried on with their mission, they carried on with their goals, they carried on with their work. So without adding the object, this phrasal verb carried on does not make sense. Here's another one. They called off the meeting. Call off. So call off what? They called off the meeting, they called off the engagement, they called off the wedding. So it could be anything, but you again need an object after the phrasal verb. So they called off. So those verbs which require an object are transitive verbs, and hence from there we get the transitive phrasal verbs. Now, transitive phrasal verbs can be of 2 types. I will come to that once I explain what intransitive phrasal verbs are. So, intransitive phrasal verbs, as opposed to transitive phrasal verbs, do not require an object for the verb to make sense. For example, if I say, Mr. Sharma passed away, I don't have to add anything after passed away. Passed away is good enough. We know that he has died. When will you get up? Get up. So when will you get up? You don't need an object. The culprit ran away. Your daughter has grown up. So ran away, grown up, passed away. These are all intransitive phrasal verbs which do not require an object. Now we can divide phrasal verbs, or we can classify phrasal verbs into 2 more types, and that is very important. So all transitive phrasal verbs can either be separable phrasal verbs or inseparable phrasal verbs, whereas all intransitive phrasal verbs are always non-separable phrasal verbs. This is because transitive phrasal verbs take an object, and the definition of a separable phrasal verb is that the object can be inserted between the verb and the preposition or adverb. Let me explain with examples. So what this means is that separable phrasal verbs can only be transitive verbs because the object gets inserted. Let's take the sentence, please turn on the fan. Turn on the fan. I can also say, please turn the fan on. So I've taken the object, that is the fan, and I've inserted it between turn and on. So please turn on the fan is correct. Please turn the fan on is also correct. I'm trying to cut down my expenses. Cut down, the object is expenses. I'm trying to cut my expenses down. So both are correct. Could you fill up this form? Could you fill this form up? So both ways the object can be inserted, and a transitive phrasal verb can be a separable phrasal verb. But not all transitive phrasal verbs are separable. You also have the inseparable phrasal verbs. In this, you cannot add the object in between. For example, you should stay away from him. You cannot say you should from him stay away, or you should stay from him away. Stay away as the phrasal verb has to stay together. So the verb and the adverb away have to be together. You cannot break them. So this is an inseparable phrasal verb. Another is looks after. The nurse looks after him. You cannot say the nurse looks him after. Again, look after is a non-separable or inseparable phrasal verb. Now this only comes with practice and a lot of reading as to which of these are separable and which is non-separable. As I said, all intransitive verbs are non-separable because anyway it does not take an objective. However, let me come back and give you a small tip. If ever we use the personal pronoun, that is he, she, him, her, it, instead of the noun, so if the object is a noun, we are using a separable phrasal verb, and instead of the noun we are using a personal pronoun, then it is always, that is the personal pronoun is always inserted between, so it is always a separable one. For example, have you worked out the problem? So worked out is the phrasal verb, the problem is the noun. Instead of saying the problem, if I say it, I cannot say have you worked out it. I have to say have you worked it out. So it becomes a separable phrasal verb and the personal pronoun comes in the middle. Have you worked it out? Suppose I say, when I go there, I will look up Ram, or I will look Ram up. But instead of saying Ram, if I use the word him, I cannot say I will look up him. It is I will look him up. So this is something that we need to remember. So to recap, we have 4 types of phrasal verbs. We have the transitive and the intransitive, and we have the separable and the inseparable, and the special rule about personal pronouns put in. If you have any questions, do let me know in the comments below. Do like this video and subscribe to my channel. You can also consider becoming a part of my email list. Through my emails, I send out weekly tips about English to teachers and young professionals. I'm happy to provide to you a free PDF about 75 phrasal verbs that you can use. All links are given in the description. Thank you for watching this video.